Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club, where Joseph Pearce, Vivian Dudro, and I continue to discuss Henri de Lubac's book, The Church, Paradox and Mystery. It's a phenomenal book, and we spent some time on it because there's so much to discuss here. We left off last session with finishing the discussion on pagan religions and the fathers of the church. And to summarize briefly, the idea, which was very common among the fathers of the church and was kind of revived by people like de Lubac and von Balthasar in the mid-20th century, and then was part of the council, was that the old expression, "there's no salvation outside the church," is fundamentally true, that the only way that we can be saved is through Jesus Christ and his mystical body, the church. That does not mean that only those who are visibly and explicitly members through baptism are saved, but it does mean that Christ's presence in secret ways throughout the cosmos and the universe and the world and our planet, from the beginning of time until the end, is such that all those whom God has created in his image have access to salvation through Christ and through his church. But that does not mean, in the Rhinerian idea, there's a anonymous Christianity, that everybody's really Christian and all Christ does is tell us who we really are. But no, the more important point is that Christ brings both redemption and revelation. That is, he's the one who saves us and Adam and others, and he's the one who reveals to us that he's our salvation. Anyway, that's a brief summary of that chapter, which is a very important chapter. But now we go on to something which is more historical. The 5th chapter, Paul VI, Pilgrim to Jerusalem. Any comments? Any monologues?
Well, on the very first page, he's saying how the Pope is about to announce something extraordinary. A Pope going on a pilgrimage being something extraordinary. And the reason why that caught my eye is because I entered the church during the pontificate of John Paul II, who was a pilgrim extraordinaire. I mean, he traveled so many places, and I just didn't appreciate at the time how rare this really was. And then on page 137, de Lubac specifies that Paul VI was the first pope to leave Italy in over a century and a half.
Yeah, I'm the same. I also came to the church during the pontificate of St. John Paul II. But I think there's a message here, perhaps, or a lesson, is that that John Paul II sort of was a saint and a pope, but he's not the every saint or every pope, and he had his own charisma, and he did things his way, and he traveled the world, and that was his charisma, and I think that, and he was a good holy man, and I think there's a problem with that is that we don't expect every priest to travel the world and be a good holy man, and history tells us that most priests don't travel the world, and most popes don't travel the world, and many popes, at least, are not holy men. So I think that's important, because what we've set in place is a cardboard cutout. Every pope is going to be as good, in not just as good as JP2, but in JP2's way of being good. Right?
Yeah. We sort of set him up as a model because that was the only pope I ever knew. And yes.
And I suspect that in the Middle Ages and before and sometimes after, if you were living in England or Germany or Africa, you may not even know who the Pope was.
Yes.
But now, every breath he takes or every statement he makes on an airplane becomes known worldwide.
Yeah.
There's a value to that, and there's a danger to that.
Yes.
But you said
the church stands or falls on every off-the-cuff remark of a pope reported by the media. I mean, there's something wrong with that, right?
Yes.
And as I, who am now a very old man, I think I can categorize myself that way, who've lived through several papacies, as a Catholic, one must respect the authority of the See of Peter, no question about it. But one can't adjust one's spirituality and one's faith and what one believes by the current pope. I mean, I don't know how many popes I've had, 5 or 6 in my lifetime. So, and the popes, their primary purpose is to preserve and guard and protect what has been passed on from the beginnings of the church, the deposit of faith. And therefore, we must love the Pope in his role as Pope. We must be obedient to his authoritative statements. But Christ is the head of the church, not the Pope.
Mm.
The Pope is the vicar of Christ, stands in the place of Christ, but he's supposed to lead us to Christ. Therefore, we see, especially if you learn history, that there's been rises and falls in the papacy over time. And we here at this particular, table, and where you are, Joseph, we've been blessed with some of the greatest popes in the history of the church. I think 33 years of John Paul II and Pope Benedict. I mean, those are high points in the papacy, really. Mm. But as you said, Vivian, the Pope had been out of Rome for 100 years. No Pope after Peter had ever visited the Holy Land.
Wow.
I mean, I was shocked at that because it's such a pilgrimage site,
Right. And that's the reason why he went. And that's the reason why he went. The land, his own quote here that de Lubac copies on page 136, the land from which Peter came. We shall visit that venerable land from which Peter came and to which not one of his successors had returned. That was Father's point. And why? We shall return humbly and very briefly in a spirit of prayer, penitence, and spiritual renewal, so as to offer Christ his church, to call our separated brothers to this one and holy church, to beg divine mercy on behalf of the peace that still appears to be so weak and precarious, and finally, to beseech Christ our Lord for the salvation of the entire human race. We know this is God's desire to save all, and so it is good and right and just for us to pray that somehow, some way that happens, and that's what he's going to do.
And there were really two fundamental what do I call them? Two fundamental purposes for this meeting. One was, as you said, which he explains again on page 137 in the middle, but quite properly, the ecumenical effect of such an initiative received the most attention. It was in fact reasonable to suppose that it could do more for the cause of union than any amount of writing or discussion. That is, showing that the Catholic Church, originates from Jesus, just as the other churches do. But the second fundamental thing, more important, de Lubac would say, was a visible expression of the fact that the church is subordinate to Christ, that the Pope comes and humbly kneels in those places where Christ was born and where he lived and taught and where he died, a visible icon of the church's submission to Christ.
I would just like to say, if we can move to page 139, I'm going to have to put my glasses on. I'm afraid that I'm finally having to surrender to reading glasses, so forgive me. Not that it's a sin. So the middle of page 139, if we may rightly expect glorious results from the post-pilgrimage to Jerusalem, for Christian unity as well as world peace, these are not the primary, even the principal reasons why the gesture, however unexpected, is admirably opportune in the present situation. It is, first of all, a gesture of faith, a gesture of faith par excellence, the essential gesture to make the full signification of the church appear. So this is following up, Father, from what you just said. C.S. Lewis famously said, if you want the world in order to get to heaven, you'll get neither. If you, I'm garbling that. Do you remember this now? You might not remember, so putting me on the spot here. Basically, if you seek the world instead of heaven, you'll get neither. But if you seek heaven, you'll get the world thrown in. That's essentially what he said. And I think the important thing is that we've got to get things in the right order or priority. Yes, there might be some good political consequences, and there might be some ecumenical consequences of the Pope visiting Jerusalem. But the Pope's visiting Jerusalem because he's a Christian. That's the most important thing. And then everything else might be a correlative, might be a fruit, but that's not the reason. And again, what we see here is de Lubac being very Christocentric in his understanding of the church and his understanding of Paul VI's motives.
Yes, let me lose all our listeners and viewers here as I sing. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all things will be added to you. Anyway, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all things will be added to you. And Joseph, just below what you quoted on the same page 139, no more expressive gesture could have been found than the sight of the church going in the person of her visible head to prostrate herself at the feet of her Lord. Yep.
And
I actually highlighted the following sentence after what you've just quoted. By this pilgrimage, the entire church, tiny and as it were prostrate, prepares to go and kiss the feet of Christ.
And then down further on the middle of that page, not only to recall them to their origins, but also invite them to reattach themselves to the very center, the heart of their Christian faith. In other words, we always need to renew that commitment, don't we?
We do. It's called anamnesis, for one thing, remembering, going back. And I think about this now as I'm an older priest celebrating Mass. I mean, there's no Mass reading I haven't heard before. Even a 3-year cycle, I've probably heard it 20 times. Well, 50 years by 3, so 17 times. But it's not new. But I have to say it again, repeat it, and then relate it to what's happening today, because it's always new in its application. But we need to be reminded every moment, every day, of truths which are eternal, which is why, for example, the church has had this tradition of the Angelus, remembering the incarnation at morning, midday, and night. Why do that 3 times a day? Because we need to be called back from all the attractions and distractions of our work and the world around us to the fundamental truths. But that's just remembering. Then what about entering into the essence of it? That's what the sacrament, that's the Eucharist. We receive our Lord every day if we're blessed to do that. All right. Anything more on this chapter, Paul VI, Pilgrimage to Jerusalem? Vivian, I see you circled that word there. And
I circled the word no.
Yeah, so negative.
He does talk a little bit about, trying to overcome this triumphalism and clericalism and all that. But this gesture, the Pope is acting very humbly the way he went about doing this. And de Lubac ends this chapter by saying, no, the church is not seeking her own glory, but only that of her Lord.
Yeah, I don't think triumphalism is a problem so much anymore.
No, it's not.
Well, now we come to chapter 6. It's a phenomenal chapter. It's called.
I'd like to make a comment, Father, before you set the scene, because obviously von Balthasar much better than I do. I'd like to say something about this chapter in general, having recently read it. It's what I would say about this book. that I knew just about nothing about de Lubac except what I've read secondhand in other things. So it's a great joy and an enlightenment to me to actually be able to read this. And again, ditto with von Balthasar. I've only knew von Balthasar secondhand through what I've heard other people say in the other writings. And of course, I'm doing the same here. It's not von Balthasar. But but there's a whole chapter by de Lubac on von Balthasar, which actually opened my eyes and my mind to aspects of him, which I either didn't know at all, or only half digested, only half gleaned. So it's been, again, a very fruitful experience for me reading this chapter.
Well, especially in light of some of the more popular expressions of people on von Balthasar who are highly critical of him. And he's a human being. He's a sinner like we are. But, some people can focus on one little thing they think is some kind of incredibly terrible thing, which may or may not be terrible. But when you look at Balthasar as de Lubac describes him here, I mean, this is a man of culture, a man of the church, a man who loved the church, who served the church. And maybe he's a theologian. We can disagree with this or that. But you can't simply write him off as some kind of a heretic. That's been said too.
Yep, in print even.
Yeah. So chapter 6, A Witness of Christ in the Church, Hans Urs von Balthasar. Now, this is a book about the council, really. These are commentaries on Vatican II. And Balthasar, although one of the preeminent theologians of his day, was not invited as a peritus, an expert, to the council. Why not? The council began in 1962. Balthasar left the Jesuit order in 1947. That was seen as a bad thing in those days. I always told our friend who's now deceased, Bishop Morlino of Madison, Wisconsin, I said, Bishop Morlino, you are the most brilliant most brilliant bishop in our conference because you left the Jesuits. He was a Jesuit novice and he left at some point.
But he remained a priest and then went on to be a bishop. And Balthasar remained a priest and was named cardinal.
That's right.
By John Paul II. So it isn't as though he, fled his vows and went off
But in the middle of 145, de Lubac says, speaking about Balthasar's non-participation in the council, perhaps all in all, it is better that he was allowed to devote himself completely to his task, to the continuation of a body of work so immense in size and depth that the contemporary church has seen nothing comparable. For a long time to come, the entire church is going to profit from it. So he sees a providential thing there. He wasn't involved in the politics and the daily activities and the tremendous amount of work you have to do when you're at the council. He was able to begin to do his work. Well, I remember, I think I mentioned to you people that have watched this for a while, that I accompanied de Lubac to this meeting of the Papal Theological Commission in 1970 or 71, something like that. And Balthasar was there. And it was a commission meeting for 2 or 3 days, so a lot of papers and discussion and so on. But during that time, Balthasar read all the historical works of Shakespeare because he was preparing his volume, Theodrama, in which he made the point that no theologians in the past have ever drawn the theological consequences from Christian drama, which he considered Shakespeare to be a principal expression. So here's this man at a meeting with committees and stuff like that, and he's reading all of Shakespeare's historical works.
Can I ask a question, Father? As you know, von Balthasar, this book was written in the late 60s. How much more did von Balthasar write after this?
Oh, well, as I say, his major work, this trilogy, which is Theological Aesthetics, which is 7 volumes, and Theological Dramatics, which is, I think, 5 volumes, and Theological Logic, which is 3 volumes. He was only at the beginning or towards the middle of that middle thing, Theodrama, in 1970. So he went on to finish that and also the theologian. So he wrote a lot more after that.
This tribute basically is a tribute based upon only a part of the man's corpus, in fact.
Yes, yes.
And Father, why don't you tell us just how it is that you did know von Balthasar so well? You studied with him and when you worked on your dissertation? Or?
Well, did I tell a story? Maybe. Well, anyway.
Not in this book.
Okay, well, because I grew a beard back in 1968, I ended up going to France for theology. Now, that's not obvious how that would happen, but anyway, that's what happened. And I got to know Father de Lubac there in Lyon in 1969, where he was considered démodé, passé, out of fashion, thing of the past, because that was post-conciliar, confusion. But I got to know him, and he was a wonderful, friendly, helpful mentor for me. But I remember he was, because he was, I think we
Can I interrupt just a sec?
Yeah.
Did I ask you to explain your relationship with de Lubac or von Balthasar?
Von Balthasar.
Okay, good. I want to make sure you're headed down that
when
track.
you're my age, Vivian, if you're lucky to get to that age, because it's a blessing to be old, As I say, there's only one cure for old age, and that's death. But
I put Vivian's confusion there down to her jet lag, which probably is similar to old age.
Okay. So he was often bedridden because he'd been injured in World War I. And I would sometimes come and serve his mess. I wasn't a priest at the time. And I remember, he gets out of bed, he puts on his shoes, takes off his slippers, puts on his shoes. I said, what's that for? He said, well, I can't serve mess in my slippers. I need to put my shoes on, So we went down there. I served his mass. And then afterwards I said, well, at that time I realized I was going to be asked to go for a doctorate by my superiors. And I asked him, well, Father de Lubac, what do you think I should write my thesis on? He said, Hans Urs von Balthasar, the greatest theologian of our time and perhaps of all time. Sorry, and the Dominicans watching this, but anyway. And then I said, well, okay, I didn't know much about Balthasar. And where should I do this? He said, well, there's a very fine young theologian in Regensburg, Germany, a professor there, Professor Ratzinger, and I'll write him on your behalf. And so it was de Lubac that wrote Ratzinger to have me do my thesis on Balthasar. And then in the summers, Balthasar would invite de Lubac to come with him up to the Rigi Hüsli, which you visited a couple of weeks ago or last week.
Just last week.
Vivian. A little chalet cabin on this mountain in Switzerland, which is surrounded by a big lake on three sides. You can't get there by car. You have to take a cog railway or a Seilbahn, one of these cable telepheric they say in France. I don't know what to call them in English, but anyway. And so I was there with another scholastic, that is a Jesuit in studies, helping, doing the cooking, the dishes, and celebrating Mass with de Lubac and von Balthasar. So that was part of my knowledge of him, was from, that direct association.
And didn't you write some of your dissertation at that little house?
Yes, a great, I would say one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, almost totally unknown, Ferdinand Ulrich, who was a friend of Balthasar's and de Lubac's. And one winter, yes, we went up to Rigi Hüsli, and he helped me write my thesis. Yeah.
And your topic of your thesis was?
The origin of the church in Christ's kenosis according to the ecclesiology of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Oh, and wow. Joseph, that helps answer your previous question, because this was 1974, and one reason that I was able to write my thesis so quickly is that Balthasar hadn't finished writing all of his books. I didn't have to read them all, and there was not a bunch of secondary literature on him. So I could do a thesis on this theologian without having to read this immense, like if you do something on Augustine, you got literally thousands of volumes about him, whereas von Balthasar at that time didn't have all that secondary literature.
And kenosis being this
Emptying self, yeah, that's Philippians 2, Christ emptied himself, yeah, kenosis.
And that comes up in this chapter with the whole lance and everything. So we'll that sets us up for the discussion where it's going to end up with this chapter.
Page 146. I'm just going to
yes, please do, because I practically underlined everything. This was like this chapter really, because I was just there in Switzerland visiting these places important to von Balthasar, and anyway, this chapter just moved me very much.
Last paragraph on page 146, just the first sentence. De Lubac says of von Balthasar, his spiritual diagnosis of our present civilization is the most penetrating to be found.
Yep.
Now, all of us who are here, talking about this, you've watched this, from reading de Lubac, he's not a man of exaggeration.
Mm-hmm.
He's very careful. He cites his sources. He expresses it clearly. There's not a bunch of, excessive emphasis on things. As when I was growing up, dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. So when he says something like that, most penetrating diagnosis of our civilization, that's a very powerful statement coming from someone like him.
It is, and I sent von Balthasar's Truth of the World to an Orthodox Jewish philosophy professor I had in college. And he read it and he wrote me back and he said, this is the most penetrating diagnosis of our civilization. I mean, he practically said this.
Really?
He had ever read, and he said, and I've read them all. And so for this Jewish man to see in von Balthasar this genius and to declare him in these kinds of terms, that's called triangulation.
Yeah. Anything before page 148?
I've got a high.
Well, this extraordinary learning.
Page 148. Sorry, Vivian.
He mentions his von Balthasar's extraordinary learning.
Where?
On page 147. Okay. When one observes the extraordinary learning, and like you just said, de Lubac is not using superlatives and all this unnecessarily. And I was just in von Balthasar's library, 30,000 books. He read every single one in Greek, Latin, German, English, French, Spanish, and he had a photographic memory, and so he only had to read a book once. And this is the key thing: extraordinary learning that is displayed without pedantry. In other words, the way von Balthasar writes, all of this vast knowledge just spills out of the page, but in this very unassuming, self-aggrandizing way. It's just what he knows is coming out onto the page.
Well, Vivian, you saw now the archives in the basement, all like library stacks. And when I visited him, I don't know, it was 1995, something like that. I stayed in the house, and it was a 4-story apartment building type house. And every room except the bathroom and the kitchen had bookshelves on all walls. Any wall space was a bookshelf. Plus, there was, a library in the basement with these stacks. And so, I had given him this book in German by Manfred Hauke called Women in the Church, on the idea of women's ordination, because that was going to be the topic to be discussed by the Papal Commission of Theologians the next year. And I gave him the book, and I said, it's about a 500-page book. I said, have you read this? No, I haven't read it. Oh, well, I'll take a look at it, he said. So, okay, 9 o'clock, we were having dinner, we go to bed. I get up, and I go through all the other rooms in the house, and I'm looking at these bookshelves, And, Germans, they've got like 26 volumes of Nietzsche and 27 volumes of Hegel and 32 volumes of Schleiermacher or whatever, as well as other things, as far as literature and everything. So I would go and randomly, I'd pick out a book, open it up, and sure enough, on every book, there was his pencil notations in it. I said, well, how many are there? I'm kind of a amateur wannabe mathematician, so I counted how many books there were on a shelf and how many shelves there were and how many in a room and down in the basement. And I calculated, I'm glad I came around, I calculated 30,000 volumes, which turns out what it was. So 30,000 volumes, and apparently he read them all.
He read them all.
So the next morning, we're having breakfast, okay? Remember, I've given him a 500-page book, or 450, whatever, the night before. And he says, well, Father Fessio, I've read this now, and I'm going to tell the Theological Commission we no longer need to discuss this topic because everything we need to know is in this book. Then I asked him, as a publisher, I said, well, do you have any recommendations for books in German which we should translate in English? He walks over and he says, Joseph Pieper. He said, anything by Pieper, it's not in English, put it in English. But that was my experience with those 30,000 volumes.
Yes.
We are saying, just a way of encapsulating and summarizing the discussion you've just been having. On page 148, below that break with the asterisks, there's very beautiful prose by de Lubac praising the depth and breadth of von Balthasar's.
Well, read that, because I was going to read that, but you read it, Joseph. Go ahead.
Yeah, I highlighted the whole passage because apart from anything else, it just says what you said about the extent of his knowledge and reading, but it's also written very beautifully. I mean, even in translation. This man is perhaps the most cultivated of his time. If there is a Christian culture anywhere, it is here. Classical antiquity, the great European literatures, the metaphysical tradition, the history of religions, the diverse experiments of contemporary man in search of himself, and, above all, the sacred sciences, St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, patristics, all of it, not to speak of the Bible. There is nothing great that is not welcomed and made vital by this great mind. Writers and poets, mystics and philosophers, old and new, Christians of all persuasions, he invites all of them to add their note. For him, all of these voices are necessary in order to bring about, for the greater glory of God, the Catholic symphony.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his books is titled Die Wahrheit ist symphonisch. Truth is symphonic. Oh, you put that in? Okay, that's good. One little comment on that, the parenthesis there, where he says patristics, parenthesis, all of it, close parenthesis. We're in the West, and theologically, our knowledge of the fathers was basically Augustine, Bonaventure, and so on, which is wonderful. But we had neglected the other lung of the church, the Eastern fathers, Athanasius, Great Vernissa, Great Nazianzen, Basil, and so on. And Balthasar knew all those as well, and that he integrated those. Well, this is good. I mean, we'll come back next session to continue this. It's a beautiful chapter on a wonderful theologian that everybody should know something about, it seems to me. Thank you all. God bless you. See you next week.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.